All right. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to this is class number 6. I know on the thing it said that we were going to do 8 classes. I think the plan is to do 9. And so I think we're going to inevitably not be able to get through everything today because today is probably the broadest topic, both Zionism and anti-Zionism within the context of 1800s and 1900s. So we can set the stage a little bit and give, a brief overview of everything that we did the last couple of weeks, which I think will nicely dovetail into a discussion of how Zionism ended up on the Jewish scene really in a major way. We've been discussing, for those following, this big tension of modernity that Jews have, starting with the Haskalah, where there was this dual tension where on the one side, Jews were dealing with the same mainstream questions that, say, the Christian world was dealing with, which is, how do you breach modernity? So questions of evolution and what happens when you realize the sun is the center of the solar system and not the earth, and those questions of science. But at the same time, the Jewish community was also involved in wider questions of politics and political emancipation. And how do you argue to mainstream society that you are worthy of equal rights? This is one of the main jobs of the Maskilim, is trying to make the argument in one way or another that Jews should be able to achieve equal rights in places like France and Germany, and then other places in Western Europe. And so almost all of the thinkers that we've gone through the last couple of weeks, certainly Moses Mendelssohn, Abraham Geiger, who started the Reform movement, Rav Hirsch, who founded what we now know to be neo-Orthodoxy, they were all engaged in this conversation of emancipation and the way that they did it, and for all the differences of the Reform movement, the conservative movement, and what eventually became the modern Orthodox movement, they would have all agreed with the simple premise in the late 1800s that Judaism is best thought of in terms of religious identity, right? This is going to be a radical claim that the Zionists are going to challenge, and we'll see that today. But they would have all generally said Judaism has beliefs that Jews should share and different practices that those beliefs should inspire, right? The sort of textbook definition of a religion, very much, for those paying attention, the first week, very much modeled after a type of Protestantism. And this would have connected for all Abraham Geiger and Rav Hirsch would have disagreed, and trust me, they disagreed about everything under the sun. We talked about that the last 2 weeks. They would have all generally agreed with the fact that Judaism is primarily religious, and there is a spiritual and ethical, and that really is the end goal of Judaism. We saw last week, many have actually classified Hirsch as a anti-Zionist. It's a little bit anachronistic, but we saw Hirsch last week in his magnum opus, the 19 Letters, where he essentially said, when talking about emancipation, that Judaism is not a blood and soil type tradition, right? Judaism is a spiritual tradition, and what that allows Hirsch and also the Reform movement to do is to make the argument that there's no contradiction. There's no inherent contradiction between Jewish identity and nationalistic, say, German identity, right? These thinkers were all German, so we'll stick with Germany for a while. And this allowed them to then make the argument to wider German society and say, hey, we are a religion. There's no conflict between Jewish identity and being a good citizen of the nation of Germany. All such, claims of dual loyalty and a state within a state, right? Those are overblown. Again, we're a religion. We're the same as, there's Protestants, and in some of these countries, there's some Catholics, and there's, different denominations of Christianity, and, view us similar to that, right? Judaism obviously is different in some major ways from Christianity, but it should be thought of as in the same category, right? Catholicism, Protestantism, and Judaism, right? They're all isms. This is very much something that's going to be taken to task by the Zionists, and we'll get to Theodor Herzl, who's probably the best known, in a second. But before we go to Herzl, I wanted to start with probably a lesser known precursor to Zionism. He's often thought of a proto-Zionist, and his name is Moses Hess, or Moshe Hess. And just to give a little bit of a background, you can see how interesting the Jewish community was in Germany in the mid-1800s. Hess was a friend of Karl Marx. They actually worked together early in his life. Hess was a devoted Marxist, and so there's some interesting literature that Moses Hess actually gave Marx some ideas, and they were very much, intellectual companions in the sense where they bounced ideas off of each other. And they were going to have sort of a big split later on in their life. We haven't had much time to talk about Marx, but Marx was, of course, very anti-nationalistic, certainly later on in his life. And Moses Hess is going to come out with the exact opposite conclusion. And he's going to put forth the first argument in modernity that Jewish identity can't be thought of in religious terms and has to be thought of in terms of nation and nationhood and national status. And so we'll dip in a little bit in Moses Hess. The other thing that I'll say by introduction is that he is very much not a fan, or he was very much, he's been dead for a while, was very much not a fan of the Reform movement. And so we'll see early on his criticism really starts by, taking it to the reformers. And we'll see why, right? It's a very interesting criticism of the Reform movement that we'll see why in 1 second. So here's what he writes. His magnum opus is called Rome and Jerusalem. It's not very long. If anyone's interested, highly recommend giving it a read. I think it's still, interestingly enough, a lot of the politics are still relevant to our time now. So he writes as follows. He says, no reform of the Jewish religion, however extreme, is radical enough for the educated German Jew. But the endeavors are vain. Even conversion itself does not relieve the Jew from enormous pressure of German anti-Semitism. The German hates the Jewish religion less than the race. He objects less to the Jews' peculiar beliefs than to their peculiar noses. So he's going to say something, and again, this is fascinating. This is 70 years before, or 65 years before Hitler's rise to power, right? And Moses Hess is realizing something, and his observation is, well, all of these different movements, Moses Mendelssohn, Abraham Geiger, all the great Jewish denominational movements of trying to reconcile Judaism and modernity, they are trying to make Jewish beliefs and Jewish practice, right, the religion of Judaism, more palatable to wider German society. And he takes specific issue with the Reform movement because one of the main goals of the German Reform movement was essentially to say, listen, Judaism is very similar to Protestantism. Yes, we have a couple differences. Yes, we don't accept Jesus, right? That's a big one. But our synagogues look like churches. Our beliefs are very much the same, right? This idea of ethical monotheism. We have injected a spirit of universalism, a la Immanuel Kant that we talked about the first week with Moses Mendelssohn. And so the reformers are sitting there saying, it's only a matter of time, right? Maybe months, maybe a few years until German society accepts Jews as fully equals because, hey, why wouldn't they? We're a new reformed religion. And what Moses Hess is saying, he's saying, you have it all wrong. The German anti-Semitism is not primarily religious motivated. He's saying this is different. There's something different happening in modernity than medieval anti-Semitism, right? Medieval anti-Semitism, one could probably encapsulate that it was something wrong with what Jews believed, right? How do we know that? Because if you were in France in the year 1100 and you converted to Christianity, 99% of the time you were fully accepted and great, no more anti-Semitism against you. What Moses Hess is saying is reforming Judaism and even Jews converting to Christianity is not going to be enough because there's something racial, right? He's the first one to really talk about Jewish identity in racial categories. And it's clear, I'll just point out one more thing for background. It's clear that Moses Hess talking about Jewish identity in racial categories means that this was a topic of conversation already in Germany in the 1860s and 70s, right? Literature doesn't come out of a vacuum. So clearly there was some conversation going on of while Jews were trying to say, hey, we're a religion, it's clear that other people were saying, how are you a religion? Judaism's a race, right? And, he's picking on, certain Jewish phenotypes such as the nose, right? We all know, the idea that Jews have long noses. And so Moses Hess is saying, right, we can read on a little bit. He says, neither reform nor conversion nor emancipation throw open the Jew the gates of social life, hence their anxiety to deny their racial descent, right? So he's saying none of this is going to work, right? He's saying everything we've tried, right, whether it's reforming Judaism, Jews actually converting to Christianity, of which happened often, or begging or asking for emancipation, that's not going to work because we are just different than the Germans, right? And then he quotes us a very interesting story. I'm going to butcher this name, but Molschat, in his physiological sketches, tells how the son of a converted Jew used to spend hours every morning at the looking glass, comb in hand, endeavoring to straighten his curly hair so as to give it a more Teutonic appearance, right? So he tells the story of this Jewish convert who every day tried to undo his curls to make himself look more German, right? This fascinating story. And so he goes on, he says, but as little as the radical reform movement, an appellation which characterizes it so well, inasmuch as it lays the axe at the root of Judaism and its national historical cult accomplished its aim, so little will the tendency of some Jews to deny their racial descent fulfill their purpose. Jewish noses cannot be reformed, and the black wavy hair of the Jews will not change through conversion into blonde, nor can its curves be straightened out by constant combing. The Jewish race is one of the primary races of mankind that has retained its integrity in spite of the continual change of its climatic experience, and the Jewish type has conserved its purity through the centuries. And so whatever we want to do with this, him engaging with clearly what now we would consider to be, pseudoscientific race science, what he's pointing out is obviously an astute political observation, knowing what happens in Germany 70 years later with the rise of Nazism and the rise of this essentially turning into a full-blown, governmental policy that Hitler would have in the Nuremberg, in Nuremberg, right? And so Moses has his saying, right, just to summarize one more time, he's saying none of this is going to work, right? We've forgotten the most fundamental thing about Judaism, which is Judaism is, what we might call today an ethnicity or a people, right? We can, race, for obvious reasons, post-Holocaust, the Jews stopped referring to ourselves as race. But Moses has this saying, hey, we are a race, and we know that, and the Germans know that, so who are we fooling, right? What is all this, foolery and conversion and reforming going to do? And so I wanted to give this introduction. He then goes on to talk about how it is only through reclaiming a Jewish identity that is not based in religion, right? This is sort of the thesis of his book. It's only through reclaiming a Jewish identity that is not rooted in viewing Judaism as a religion, but viewing Jews as a people, that Jews will be safe. And then he goes on to say, well, this is, of course, the age of, nationalism and nation states. And so he goes on to say, within German nationalism, right? It's a fascinating observation. Within German nationalism, because Jews are not part of the German nation, Jews can never be expected to be treated equally in Germany because Jews are not Germans, right? This is how he ends his piece. And he doesn't give a, political roadmap, right? This is why he's called the proto-Zionist. Usually we think of Theodor Herzl as the first Zionist, but he's writing this 35 years before Herzl wrote anything, or 20 years before Herzl wrote anything. And so, but he already starts to lay the groundwork that's going to become perhaps the main view of all Zionists, right? There were many things that divided early Zionists. Maybe if we have time, we can get into some of those debates. But the thing that really equated all Zionists was two fundamental beliefs about the Jewish position in the world. And we can, Jews have been discussing and debating these 2 points for really hundreds of years since Zionism. Point number one is that Jewish identity is not primarily a religious identity, right? This is in exact contradistinction to the different denominations that were forming in Western Europe. This is something that the Zionists are going to very vehemently argue. Second, because Jewish identity is not primarily a religious identity, Jews are never going to be safe in the age of nationalism unless Jews have their own power in some way, right? Some thought political power, others thought cultural or social power. But these are going to be the two fundamental arguments of all Zionists, right? And it doesn't matter if you are, Theodor Herzl, socialist labor Zionist, or Zev Jabotinsky, a revisionist Zionist, what we might consider the precursor to the Israeli right and the Likud party, right? Yes, there's a lot of important debates that, happened within Zionism, but all Zionists would agree with those two basic caveats. I wanted to compare, because I did promise today was going to be both Zionism and anti-Zionism, just what was at stake for the Jewish community. Because it's very easy in the Jewish community today in 2025 to sort of poo-poo anti-Zionism as, well, those are just the Jews who haven't really read up on history, or, it's sort of crazy. Anti-Zionism in the late 1800s or early 1900s is a whole different question, because this is a pretty radical thing that thinkers like Moses Hess, and then 15 years later, Leo Pinsker in his book, Auto-Emancipation, and then eventually Herzl, right? What they're essentially saying and arguing to the mainstream Jewish community is, since Moses Mendelssohn in the 1700s, you have all spent 150 years trying to engage in this project to not assimilate in terms of lose your Jewish identity, but achieve political and social equality and emancipation in Germany. by making specific arguments of what Judaism is and what Judaism isn't to the mainstream. And all of a sudden, there rises this class of people, right, that we would call Zionists, that are attempting to say all of that is wrong, right? This project's not going to go anywhere. This project of emancipation in Europe, right? Just, hang up your hat, right? We all need to go somewhere else, right? What the anti-Zionists were going to argue back is the Zionists are, in a sense, closer in their view to the anti-Semites than to the German liberals. Now, let me unpack that, right? It's somewhat of a radical statement. It doesn't mean they're right or wrong, but there were many people in Germany at this time, and I'll unshare my screen for a second so I can, see everybody nicer. There were two groups in Germany. I mean, there were probably more than two groups, but you could think of this sort of two poles of German political thought. And on the one side, in Germany, just like any society, you have the liberals or the progressives. And what do the liberals and progressives argue in Germany in the let's pick 1850? They're arguing, of course, everybody should get political and social equality. And of course, Jews should be invited into the mainstream, and we should open up all professions for Jews, and Jews should be able to go to the university and, publish in the mainstream journals. And then you had what we might call, whatever else you want to call the anti-liberals, the illiberals. And they were saying, Jews have no place in Germany. Why should Germany give Jews equal rights, right? Jews aren't German. Jews are somewhere else. Jews are either a state within a state, or Jews are a different race than the good German race. Again, this is in the 1850s, not 1930s. And so the Jewish Maskilim, right, the men of the Haskalah, were making the argument and said, we need to side with the German liberal society, and we need to make sure to push through this liberalism, and we need to combat the people saying Jews have no place in Germany because Jews are another state or another nation or another people. What the Zionists started saying is, hey, this whole project of emancipation and the Haskalah and the German liberals, right, they're wrong. Right? It actually turns out that the anti-Semites, they are correct, not in terms of their end, but in terms of one of their premises, right? The anti-Semites had been arguing for, about 70 years at this point, after the nationalistic revolution and after, Germany ushered in something resembling a, emancipation of the Jews, right? Same situation in France. America's a little bit more complicated. We can talk about that perhaps in a few minutes. What the German anti-Semites were arguing is, no, the Jews are something else. And the Zionists said, they're right? They're wrong in terms of, maybe kicking Jews out, right? The Zionists didn't want Germany to expel the Jews, but the Zionists were coming onto the scene and essentially not just challenging the reformers or the Maskilim's conception of what it was to be a Jew, right? Is Judaism a religion or a people, right? That debate we still have. It's a great debate. One of my favorite questions to be asked. But they were also essentially saying the anti-Semites are essentially correct in one of their main premises of the Jewish community. So you can understand what was at stake for this debate. This wasn't just, one of us is going to vote for, Trump, and one of us is going to vote for Kamala Harris. So, okay, we have a lot of things to argue about, but we're at least, still within the same, contextual society. This was, one group is arguing for what they see as a future in Western Europe, with liberalism, with the reduction of race and of peoplehood origin as a denominator for how you're treated in a society. Again, what we would call, liberalism or equality or individualism. And another group, both the anti-Semites and the early Zionists, and again, we can, if anybody has follow-up questions, happy to unpack this, because this seems to always, upset people when I paint the history like this, but I think it's an interesting way to view into the history. They were saying, no, humanity, what the Zionists were arguing, humanity's not at the point yet where they're going to be able to see past innate differences in people and Jewish people, and Moses Hess is arguing. It's clear, right? You can, pick a Jew out of a crowd, right? He's essentially saying in Germany. And so it doesn't matter if a Jew reforms a religion. It doesn't matter even if I convert to Christianity, people are still going to know I'm Jewish. And so the Zionists start to argue this, and it's met with, of course, immense backlash from the religious community. Possibly the first major, anti-Zionist really creed that's put forward is the American reform movement. And so I think I actually put this text up maybe a couple of weeks ago, but in 1885, again, this is still before Theodor Herzl. In 1885, the reform movement, which at this point, I had mentioned before that there was huge waves of German Jewish immigration, of Jews from Germany that immigrated to America in 1830, 1840, 1850. And most of those Jews were Reform because most German Jews were Reform by the mid 1800s. And they wrote explicitly, and this is the Pittsburgh platform, this was the position of the reform movement for about 40 years. They said, we recognize in the Mosaic legislation a system of training the Jewish people for its mission during its national life in Palestine, right? So they say the Torah, right, Mosaic legislation, that was a system of training for when Jews were in Palestine, right? This was thousands of years ago. And today we accept as binding only its moral laws and maintain such ceremonies as elevate and sanction our lives, but reject all that are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization. It's great that back then we used to do all these rituals and sacrifices. Today we only follow the moral laws, right? This is very much Kantian, right? Immanuel Kant, right? What makes sense as a universal, that's what we're going to do, right? Particularities don't make any sense within Kant's logical system, right? And then the Pittsburgh platform says, we recognize in the modern era of universal culture, of heart and intellect, the approaching of the realization of Israel's great messianic hope for the establishment of the kingdom of truth, justice, and peace among all men. We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine, nor sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning a Jewish state. So you could imagine the reform movement, right? And they were also publishing similar things in Germany, and also a little bit in France, but mostly at this point, the bulk of the reform movement had moved to America already. They're saying, what are you talking about, essentially, to the Zionists, to the proto-Zionists? Again, this is all pre-Herzl. This is the, debates that planted the seeds of Theodor Herzl a little bit later. But they're saying, this isn't true, right? We aren't a nation. We don't expect, right, Jews that are here in Pittsburgh and Berlin, right, you can imagine, and Paris and, mainstream cities. They're almost, and there's always this interesting question, and this is true whenever people give statements. So, if you're a synagogue or an organization, you put out a statement, who's that statement for? Is it for your congregants or is it for the wider public, right? And so there's always, there's an interesting academic debate of, who was the Pittsburgh platform meant for? Was this meant for Reformed Jews to, get a nice pamphlet and say, this is what we believe? Or was it meant for the mainstream, American society to say, this is what Jews believe? Probably the second, right? And essentially they're broadcasting and they're saying, don't worry, Jews in America and by extension Germany and by extension, France and Italy later on, Jews have no dual loyalty, right? Don't get us wrong. We are fully committed to the American national project and our rituals reflect that, right? We're not doing any of the weird particularistic rituals and our politics reflect that, right? Don't worry, Jews are fully committed to American national project and Jews are fully committed to the German national project. We do not want our own state, right? Don't listen to those, very small minority, because at this point, Zionists were a very small minority. Don't listen to them who are saying, no, actually, you're right. Jews aren't really American or Jews aren't really German. We're this other thing, we're a Jewish people and a people, we're a nation and a nation needs its own state, right? So this is what was at stake. So within this field, we end up getting Herzl and there's a lot to say about Herzl's background, this sort of prototypical story of how Herzl arose was during the Dreyfus affairs, which is sort of, it's true in a narrow sense, and it's also true in a metaphorical sense. And, just to give, the 2-second background and not get derailed too far, right, Paris, which at this point was quickly becoming one of the most progressive cities for Jews in the world. This is in the late 1800s. Again, France was the first place in Europe to grant Jews political equality. So it had already been 100 years since Jews have had political equality. So no one that was alive in France in the 1880s and 1890s could have remembered a time before Jews were politically equal. And of course, Alfred Dreyfus was accused of treason. It turned out that he was let off the hook innocent, but then there was this idea that, well, he was really guilty, and not just guilty, right? There was also this conspiracy theory going around, like much Jewish conspiracy theories, that there was this sort of a secret group of Jews that were actually propping up Alfred Dreyfus to actually do something to fundamentally hurt France on behalf of this global Jewish conspiracy. This is right around the same time, by the way, that in Eastern Europe, a book called Protos of Elders of Zion would pop up that would specifically allege a global Jewish plot to take over the world by dominating the media and the banks and all of this, very much, a la, Rothschild, who was a major Jewish philanthropist in Britain at the time, right? A lot of different things happening in the late 1800s. But then mobs start to appear in the streets of Paris yelling, "Death to Dreyfus, death to Jews." And Herzl, who was, as the story goes, a young journalist, is sitting around realizing, and Herzl was completely secular, right? He had socialist leanings. He was certainly not a Zionist, right, in any sense, right? He probably had never read Moshe Hess or Leo Pinsker, right, before this moment. And he had this realization. He said, it seems like Jews are never going to be able to fit in. He's like, the slightest bit of political and social turmoil happens, and it's not just Alfred Dreyfus, this one guy is rotten, right? It's the entire Jewish community needs to be killed, and this is essentially a pogrom in one of the most progressive and most Jewishly equal cities in the world, right? Paris in the 1800s. And so this is also sort of metaphorical, because Herzl begins to start to strongly agree with Moshe Hess, and to say, it doesn't seem like there's anything Jews can do that will acquit them of anti-Semitism, right? Look at Dreyfus. He was a loyal, right? He was a loyal soldier of the French army, right? Dreyfus, to the best of my knowledge, right? He wasn't, a religious Jew. He wasn't going around, asking for time off because it's Shabbat and, I can't ride my horse on Shabbat, right? This was, for all intents and purposes, a committed French citizen who happened to be Jewish. And when the slightest bit of complication and political turmoil comes about, the onus isn't just on this one person, but essentially it's a blood libel, right? A blood libel means one Jew does something wrong, which even, sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not, but the entire Jewish community is blamed for it, right? It's one thing if I steal something from Ralph's, right? It's not good, but if I steal something from Ralph's, the appropriate response is not to say the Irvine Jewish community is made up of a bunch of robbers and thieves, we should punish all of them, right? That's not individualism and, liberalism. Liberalism is, I have to take personal responsibility. And what Herzl was realizing is this great promise of the French Revolution. We had mentioned this 3 classes ago. What was the great promise? The great promise was if Jews give up their national identity, they can have individualistic identity, right? That was the great promise. And many Jews took that promise. Many Jews were happy to say, I will exist as Daniel, the French person, as an individual, rather than Daniel the Jew. And I'll give up my primary attachment to Jewish identity, and I'll put my primary attachment to French identity. And instead of Daniel the Jew who lives in France, I am Daniel the Frenchman who happens to be Jewish, right? That was the great Jewish, promise of emancipation. And Herzl begins to realize this is a facade, right? The great promise of emancipation, of trading national identity for individualism, just doesn't work. Jews are always going to be treated as a collective and punished accordingly. And so Herzl, of course, takes pen to paper and writes what eventually became the sort of magnum opus of Zionism. In this, really, it's a pamphlet. It's not long. If you've never read the whole thing, strongly recommend it. And here's what he writes. He says, the Jewish question still exists. It would be foolish to deny it. It is a remnant of the Middle Ages, which civilized nations do not even yet seem able to shake off, try as they will. They certainly showed a generous desire to do so when they emancipated us. The Jewish question exists wherever Jews live in perceptible numbers, right? So just let's take this first paragraph. What Herzl's saying is for all the so-called evolution of Europe, we're still in the period of the Middle Ages, right? So he's taking his attack right to the roots of the Jewish both reform and Haskalah movement, right? You guys think you've made so much progress, right? You can imagine him saying to, a Jew living in Germany or France at this time, but we're still in the Middle Ages, right? The Jewish question, right? How are Jews going to integrate into wider society? It's still alive and well. He says, yes, they showed a desire to do it when they emancipated us, but it still exists. He says, where it does not exist, it is carried by Jews in the course of their migrations. We naturally move to the places where we are not persecuted, and there our presence produces persecution. This is the case in every country and will remain so, even in those highly civilized, for instance, France, until the Jewish question finds a solution on a political basis. The unfortunate Jews are now carrying the seeds of anti-Semitism into England. They have already introduced it into America. So he's saying the only thing, right, he's starting to allude it, he'll say this more explicitly in a second, but he's saying the Jewish question, right, this question that we opened with week 1, who are Jews and how do Jews integrate into wider society? He says this is always going to be an open question. And the only solution for this question, it needs to be a political solution, right? Again, this is, the premise 2 of Zionism, right? Again, premise 1 of Zionism, Jews are not a religion, Jews are a people. Premise 2, because Jews are a people or a nation, Jews need a nation state, right? This is the 1-2 premise of all Zionist philosophies. And Herzl is saying, yes, even if Jews go to places that don't have a history of anti-Semitism, right? America has no medieval history of anti-Semitism, obviously. But in the late 1800s, and anti-Semitism actually spikes in America in 1910, 1920, right? This is, a lot to say about that, a little bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. But anti-Semitism actually gets worse in America. In the year 1800, anti-Semitism in America was better. Sorry, there was less anti-Semitism in America in the year 1800 than in 1920. There was way more anti-Semitism in 1920. What changed? Well, more Jews got to America. And many anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, it's not just people who make their way across the Atlantic, right? Ideas come too. And so, well, what do you know? In the 1920s and 30s, you start to get all the same anti-Semitism that we saw in Eastern Europe with the Protocols of Elders of Zion, and eventually the anti-Semitism that would be spread by Nazism. Now, not to say that America was as bad as those places, of course not, but you had, Nazi sympathizers, and Henry Ford is a great example, right? Henry Ford was a Nazi sympathizer. He had an entire newspaper, right? He was one of the wealthiest men in America. You could sort of think of him as the Elon Musk of 1910s and 20s, both in terms of his widely respected, technological and business prowess, and his sort of, desire to get involved within politics. And, for Elon Musk, you can decide at home if that's for better or worse. For Henry Ford, certainly for Jews, it was for the worse, right? He spent all his capital, right? Back then, you didn't buy Twitter. You funded a magazine, and his magazine was just full of conspiracies about the Jewish people. And what Herzl is saying is, this is the playbook, right? Anti-Semitism, right? The other big thing that Herzl is going to argue, this is not something that all Zionists adopted, but Herzl would make this argument, is that anti-Semitism is an essentialized feature of wider society. And so what Herzl believed is that any attempt to fix anti-Semitism is just ipso facto not going to work. So you had all these debates between the Reform movement and Orthodox movement, and you had the Bund, right, Jewish socialists, and you had, Jewish capitalists, right, and, any argument under the sun, right? You had people that would argue that Marxism would solve anti-Semitism. You had other people saying that liberalism would solve anti-Semitism. Louis Brandeis, right, everyone knows Brandeis, right, the first Jewish Supreme Court justice in, I believe it was the 1910s or 20s, someone could fact check me, wrote a book called The Jewish Question and the Jewish Solution. And he gives forth his solution. And he says, once the whole world becomes, liberal Democrats, right, then anti-Semitism will be solved. Because how can there be anti-Semitism? If I see everyone here as an individual, where does anti-Semitism or racism comes in? Of course, it's not that simple. And what Herzl's arguing is that's actually just impossible, right? You're just trying to, hammer a triangle into a circle, right? It's the wrong shape, right? You're just thinking about this the wrong way. And you can almost imagine him saying this, right? He goes on and says, I consider the Jewish question neither a social nor a religious one. So he's saying any attempt to solve the Jewish question with religion or social, right? What's social? Assimilation or different forms of economics, so capitalism or Marxism, nor religious one. What is that? That's conversion to Christianity or the Reform movement or neo-Orthodoxy or historical positivism that we discussed last week, right? It is a national question. And to solve it, we must first of all establish it as an international political problem to be discussed and settled by the civilized nations of the world in council, right? We'll read 2 more lines and then we can discuss for a bit. He says, we are a people, one people. Again, a radical point. I'm actually going to unshare my screen because I want to highlight this point. I don't think I had a chance to say this when we talked about Avraham Geiger 2 weeks ago. And this is one of the things, right? It's a little bit unfair for me to sit here in 2025 and criticize, an ideology from, 1830 and 1840, because who knows what political and social pressures. And, now in retrospect, we read Moshe Hess and Theodor Herzl, and even if we, have complicated feelings about Zionism in 2025, we have that, deep down feeling like, oh, they were just right. Meaning they saw the warning signs in German society on the wall far before anyone else. So it's hard to read Moshe Hess not in the shadows of the Holocaust, right? Especially when I read him. But for 1860, I mean, who knew, right? I mean, I guess he knew, but that was very much a minority opinion. And what he was saying was a very daring thing for Jews to give up on this political project. But one big event that happened that I think I briefly mentioned this, there's a lot of events that happened in the Jewish world in the 1800s. So, wanted to keep this class to 9 weeks and not 600 weeks. But in 1840 or 1841, I believe, in Damascus, there was essentially a blood libel that happened. You could look this up. It's called the Damascus Affair. And all the nice recipes of a medieval blood libel, and this was happening in Damascus, right? Not a place that was known for much historic anti-Semitism. And again, there was a Jew who ended up, I believe a Jewish boy was sent to prison because he was accused of falsely murdering a Christian. All the things that reek of medieval blood libel. And the Jewish community had very different reactions as to how do you try to solve this. So in America, in the American Jewish community, there was a big, letter writing campaign that happened in 1841. The fun fact of American Jewish history is this is the first time the American Jewish community mobilized for anything political was in response to the Damascus affairs. So that's your fun fact of the day. But Avraham Geiger essentially coached the people that were in his community, and he said, we shouldn't do anything. This doesn't concern us, right? Because Judaism is not a people, we actually have nothing in common with the Jewish community in Damascus. It would be the same thing as saying, let's say I like a sports team. Well, there happens to be somebody in some other country that also watches that sports team. What does it have to do with me? I'm not going to hurt my political and social capital for trying to help that person any more than I would somebody who doesn't share my sports team, right? And again, I don't mean to make it so banal, but Avraham Geiger felt very strongly that the German Jewish community, which again, at that time in the 1840s was one of the biggest and well-connected in the world, should not do anything to get involved with this, what became an international scandal of and blood libel. So he is arguing very strongly that Judaism is not a people, right? Again, I'm sure he felt bad for this young boy, but no more or less bad than if you would have said that a boy went missing in, Australia at the same time that was not Jewish. In other words, that gut feeling that, today I would imagine many of us have where, I will say this about me, I feel closer if you told me that there was a family living in Italy right now and they were Jewish, I feel an innate sense of closer to that family than if you said that they were not Jewish, right? It's just true about me, right? I can imagine it's true about many of you. Avraham Geiger was saying, one should not feel that way, because if we really believe Judaism's a religion, then there's no ethnic or tribal bond, right? Theodor Herzl is again, and Moshe Hess, takes us to task. Herzl is going to argue against this even stronger. But he's saying, no matter which way you chop it, right? It's sort of the Avraham Geiger background's relevant to understand why he wants to drive this point home so strongly. He says, we are a people, one people. He says, we have sincerely tried everywhere to merge with the national communities in which we live, seeking only to preserve the faith of our fathers. It is not permitted to us. In vain are we loyal patriots, sometimes super loyal. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property of our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to enhance the fame of our native lands in the arts and sciences, or her wealth by trade and commerce. He's saying all of this activity that we've been trying in, Western Europe for the last 100 years, this is in vain, right? We have wasted our time. In our native lands, where we have lived for centuries, we are still decried as aliens, often by men whose ancestors had not yet come at a time when Jewish sighs had long been heard in the country, right? Even though Jews have been living here for longer than arguably other people, we are still considered not French or not German. Then he ends his book. He says, oppression and persecution cannot exterminate us. No nation on earth has endured such struggles and sufferings as we have. Jew baiting has merely winnowed out our weaklings. The strong among us defiantly return to their own wherever persecution breaks out. I cut the quote here, but I think we all know what he goes on to say, which is to solve this problem, Jews need a state where they have political power. One more comment to make about Herzl, and then happy to open up for questions. And we have a couple more sources if we have time. If not, we'll end up extending this for 2 weeks. Herzl, again, very much in line with his wider thought process. Nowhere really in Herzl's book does he mention Palestine, right? Israel, right? This is sort of a non-issue for Herzl. Now, there's some evidence that later on in his life, he actually started to change his mind. He wrote another book called Alt Neuland, or the Hebrew for Alt Neuland, right? You all know the Hebrew. It's called Tel Aviv, right? It was the inspiration for the city of Tel Aviv, was Herzl's book. So there he already starts to engage a little bit more with feeling connected to Jewish historic roots and everything like that. But early on, I mean, Herzl did not care at all about Judaism and about Jewish heritage and everything like that. So for Herzl, it didn't matter where, right? It's, Herzl was not a Jews need to return to our historic homeland, right? That would happen, when other early Zionists started arguing against Herzl. Herzl at one point was considering, a plot of land in Eastern Europe. At another point, he was considering Uganda. And so there were all these different proposals that Herzl was sort of going around the world shopping for. The reason why Herzl's considered the first Zionist, by the way, and not somebody like Moshe Hess or Pinsker, is because they all were talking about this sort of theoretical. Herzl writes this pamphlet, and then, he doesn't just sit in his room publishing 6 more books. He actually goes out and convenes a Congress, Zionist Congress, and starts to talk to governments and all of that. So this is Herzl. And you can kind of see how Herzl arises. Again, there's always sort of this, interesting conversation. Is Zionism a product of modernity? Is Zionism an ancient Jewish movement? We can address that in a couple of minutes. Certainly, from Herzl's perspective, Zionism is a modern movement. And so Herzl would have said, this is a movement that can only arise in the late 1800s because of what's going on in Western Europe. All right, I will pause for any and all thoughts or questions. Go for it.
Okay, first, I wanted to say in The Jewish State, Herzl's book or his pamphlet, The Jewish State, he creates a stratified society in what would be the Jewish state. He has the aristocracy. He has the what do you call it? The servant class, the ones who'll do the plumbing, the cleaning, and then you have it's a classical concept. It's the Greeks, the Romans, ancient Romans. That's the concept he had. So, and if we look at that, race is a social construct that is for political purposes, and so that the anti-Semitism forces the Jews to be together. And so I wanted to ask that because his book, The Jewish State, is looked upon as being the primary source of Israel's creation, were there other thoughts from the other early Zionists, I guess you could call them, the ones who proposed that the Jews have their own place? Did they have that racial quality or the natural aristocracy, the classical perspective about forming I guess a state or a group of people?
No,
Did
it's a
I make
great.
myself clear?
Yeah. I think so.
Okay.
You'll let me know if I
Oh,
don't
okay.
address this. So let me just there we go. So Herzl's supposed state was going to be fully egalitarian. So he didn't want people to be divided based off of anything, class, religion. Importantly, he actually writes in his his book Old New Land / Tel Aviv is sort of his imagination for what the Jewish state's going to look like, and he's predicting the Jewish state will be around in 1925. He was off by some years, but the bad guy in his book, Old New Land, is a rabbi, right? And he's a rabbi because he's trying to inject religion into the public sphere in Israel and ruin the peace that's naturally happening between Jews, Muslims, and Christians. Herzl was, very influenced by Marxist thought, right? And, same with Moshe Hess as well. Same with most of the early Zionists. And what Marx taught inherently was most strife is because of class. And so if you usher in a socialist society, no longer are people going to be treated differently based off of, religion and background. Now, Hess departs from Marx because Hess and Herzl as well might have been sort of a Marxist idealist. Maybe they said, one day, Marx will be proven right, but for now, we can't wait around for Marx to be correct, so we better go and do this ourselves. It's almost like, the Messiah. It's like, it's all well and good if you sit around in Poland waiting for Mashiach, but, also you can't sit around, if there's too much. So within, Herzl's vision, Herzl believed, and again, at this point, we would call his view naive, but he thought that once Zionists start to move to Palestine and inject a lot of money, because that was, for the first 30 years of Zionism, there was, it was mostly just fundraising. Yes, we all have the pictures of the brave chalutzim, the pioneers who are, draining the swamps and figuring out how to plant in, the arid desert. But most people who were working on behalf of Zionism, just like most Jewish organizations, the sort of unglamorous part is when you're actually trying to fundraise. So, knocking on doors in wealthy Jewish communities in London and Paris and New York and saying, can you donate? Everybody knows the sort of JNF tzedakah boxes that, were sort of everywhere. And so Herzl believed that once you bring in Western infrastructure, and this is exactly what Zionists did, right? All of a sudden, there's a new railroad system, right? You can still go to it today in Tel Aviv, the old train, right? Back then, it wasn't the old train. It was, the new train in European technology. The Zionists built hospitals. The Zionists, started desalinating water. Herzl, this is funny, in his book, Old New Land, he actually put forth a proposal to desalinate the Dead Sea. That one never came true. But it really speaks to the idea that the early Zionists and Herzl thought that they were going to bring in the best of, technological modernity, and everybody's going to say, oh my God, you're raising the quality of living, please come in. That's where he was sort of naive. He sort of downplayed the role that religion and even to some extent, ethnic conflict plays in this. And so that was very much Herzl's tension. So it was sort of an aristocracy in the same way that, all socialist thinking starts with an aristocracy, right? You have the, people who own the means of production, and then you have the workers. But I don't think his goal for, he wasn't calling it Israel, but, Zion, whatever we're going to call this Jewish state, was not necessarily, having any type of, rigid class structure. I hope that answers the question. And yes, just to address your last point, other Zionists are going to, push back on a lot of Herzl's ideas there as well. Any other thoughts or questions?
Yes, Dan, I have two. Number one, on the Pittsburgh platform, it was kind of interesting that they used the sons of Aaron, the law. And I wonder if the reform movement at that time really thought they were against Israel more as a religious issue than as a state issue, because maybe they were really afraid of that as they were trying to modernize, that they would go back to, sacrificial Judaism.
Yeah, you're 100% right. It seems like they were worried about both, because again, the project is both modernity in terms of religion and in terms of politics. They certainly, one of the things the Reform movement did, which is still, the biggest difference if you go to a Reform synagogue and an Orthodox synagogue and you open up the Siddur, the prayer book, there is no reference to the rebuilding of the temple within a Reform Siddur versus an Orthodox Siddur. It's about 60% of the prayer service. Right. So, no holiday is this more obvious than Yom Kippur. Right. In an Orthodox synagogue, you spend about 5 hours on Yom Kippur day reading through in, what I will call painstaking detail, every detail of the sacrifices that the Kohanim, right, the Kohanim, sons of Aaron, used to bring in the Beit HaMikdash in Jerusalem. And then you end with this very heartfelt prayer, please God, let us reinstate this. You don't have anything in the Reform movement that's like that because of that ideological difference. So it's both. They're both arguing against the sort of, this temple-centric messianism, but then they're also, clearly when they say Judaism is a religion, they are sort of very much putting themselves on the side of, we don't want anybody going around calling Jews a nation or a people, because that gets in the way of our practice. So yeah, that was a great observation.
The other thing is, maybe I'm getting ahead of our discussion, but when you talk like the Dreyfus affair kind of woke up the Jewish community, is it the same way that somewhat happened with the October 7th terrorist attack? That when you saw all the anti-Semitism on college campuses, especially against Jewish students, and the whole issue, was it because they were Zionists or was it because they were Jewish? And a lot of the reaction, not just from the American right, but a lot of the anti-Semitism was coming from the American left. is that very much similar. That, I mean, we're kind of facing the same issue. Once again, are we a religion? Are we a race? Are we a group of people?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great comparison. I think probably. I mean, we don't know what movements October 7th is going to spark in the wider Jewish community, for another couple of years. But I think you're totally right that I think this is very much you know, the Dreyfus affair is very similar to October 7th. At the very least, taught a big segment of French Jews no amount of assimilation is safe enough. Because, if Dreyfus, who is, again, Dreyfus was not running around as a, Hasidic Jew, if this is happening to him, then this can happen to any one of us. October 7th probably has some similar undertones as well. So it's a really interesting comparison. So I want to just spend 5 more minutes on the last source here, and then next week we'll probably continue with some more Zionists, and also we'll get into some of the criticism of Herzl, and also Achad Ha'am, who's going to be our next thinker that we see. So Achad Ha'am, or Asher Ginsburg, was also in the first Zionist Congress, and he, listens to Herzl's speech, which is very much built off of this pamphlet. And just one interesting biographical difference: Herzl grew up in Western Europe. He did not grow up in a traditional Jewish home, and so he probably didn't have much of a Jewish background. There's some debate about whether or not he even had a bar mitzvah, but again, we all sort of, know the, stereotype of the, American Jew who maybe had a bar mitzvah, but, isn't very educated, doesn't really cling to their Jewish identity, right? That's Herzl pre-Dreyfus affairs. There was another thinker that arose as one of the Zionist greats. He eventually became known as Achad Ha'am, but his name earlier on was Asher Ginsburg. And Ginsburg grew up in modern-day Ukraine, so Eastern Europe, and he grew up in a Hasidic community. And so sort of the exact opposite of Herzl in terms of upbringing. And he also, growing up, he ended up, sort of leaving his orthodoxy, but keeping a lot of the spirit of Hasidism, sort of alive in him. And we talked about Hasidic Judaism, I think, week 2 or 3, so I'll refer people back to that. But he essentially injected a spirit of, Hasidic-like thinking into the modern political force of Israel, eventually coming up with what we would now call cultural Zionism. But we can look at what Achad Ha'am wrote. Let me just pull it up for 1 second. This will be a good way to end of this big debate that Achad Ha'am ends up having with Herzl. This is one of the great debates of Jewish modernity, and arguably this is still one of the great debates of the modern state of Israel, where Achad Ha'am is going to challenge Herzl with this an initial sentence in his book, and he's going to say, it's not only Jews who have come out of the ghetto, Judaism has come out too. So he's already going to sort of speak to what's eventually going to become his main thesis, which is Herzl's only talking about Jews, right? Herzl's talking about Jewish emancipation and Jewish safety and Jewish assimilation and Jews trying to reform and it's not working and Jews need protection, but Herzl's not talking at all about Judaism, right? It's as if Herzl is viewing Jews just as a nation/ethnicity. And Achad Ha'am, again, coming from a very, Hasidic background, is saying, well, wait a minute, we also do have this, deep religious, spiritual, traditional culture, whatever we want to call the religious aspect of Judaism. And this is also in crisis in modernity. It's not just that Jews are in physical crisis. Jews are also in spiritual crisis in modernity. Here's what he writes. He says, Judaism seeks to return to its historic center in order to live a life of natural development therein, to bring its powers into play in every arena of human culture, to develop and perfect those national possessions which it has acquired up until now, and thus to contribute to the common stock of humanity, in the future as in the past, a great national culture, the fruits of unhampered activity of a people living according to its own spirit. So what Achad Ha'am is pointing to is he's saying, there's a crisis in Jewish life. What's the crisis? Judaism is naturally very innovative, very creative, right? We come up with good ideas, right? He's saying those ideas seem to be helpful to the common stock of humanity, right? We have some good things to give the world. But Judaism, within the context of Europe in the late 1800s, early 1900s, is sort of stuck, right? Judaism, as opposed to having more of a, right, if someone's creative, the last thing you want them to do is give them restraints, right? If someone's creative, you want to give them a blank canvas and you want to say, go, right? Don't say, well, you could only use this one marker and you could only color on Tuesday from 8 to 9 and you could only be in this corner of the city. And oh, by the way, don't talk about or paint this because that's upsetting, right? There's nothing worse for a creative type than to be given, very strict constraints. And what Ahad Ha'am is noticing about Judaism with the rise of orthodoxy on the one hand and reform movement on the other is all of these different religious denominations of Judaism, they're just so full of rules and they're so strict and they're so rigid, right? He's talking both reform and orthodoxy, right? He's not, right? He's equally critical of both, right? It's different than Moshe Hess, who was more critical of reform, right? Ahad Ha'am is just saying, Judaism in its natural form, right? And again, one of the things I joked about a couple weeks ago is every modern Jewish thinker is going to argue that their project for the Jewish people is returning Judaism to its original spirit. So, anytime you meet a modern Jewish thinker, certainly the 10 we've seen so far, they're all going to make the argument in its idealized form way back when everybody was doing the way that I'm proposing now. So Ahad Ha'am is no different. And he's saying, what do you need in order to be creative? You need room, you need space, you need power over the public sphere. You need social power, right? It's very hard to be creative if, as, one early reformer said, you should be a German in the streets and a Jew at home, right? Save your Judaism for your living room. Don't bring your Judaism out into public. Ahad Ha'am is saying, well, what creativity is going to come out of that, right? So here's what he says. He says, for this purpose, Judaism needs at present but little. It needs not an independent state, but only the creation of conditions favorable to its development. A good-sized settlement of Jews working without hindrance in every branch of culture, from agriculture and handicrafts to science and literature. This Jewish settlement will become, over the course of time, the center of the nation. Then from this center, the spirit of Judaism will go forth to the great circumference to all the Jewish communities of the diaspora and will breathe new life into them and preserve their unity. And when our natural culture in Palestine has attained that level, we may be confident that we'll produce men in the country who will be able, in due time, to establish a state which will be a Jewish state and not merely a state of the Jews, right? If there's one line to summarize Ahad Ha'am, it's establishing a state that will be a Jewish state and not a state of the Jews. And so Ahad Ha'am in this First Zionist Congress, he hears Herzl's message and he essentially saying, Herzl is only addressing half of our problem. And, one of the things that's interesting between Ahad Ha'am and Herzl is there's a lot of ways in which they're sort of, I'll give my opinion, they were both a little bit naive for different reasons. Herzl thought that he was going to essentially import Western European Jewish culture just into a state. There's actually a funny letter that Herzl wrote early in his life to Ben Yehuda, who was another early Zionist. Ben Yehuda is best known for really reinventing the language of Hebrew. And Herzl writes this letter to Ben Yehuda saying, are you ridiculous? Do you really think that, we're going to be able to order a train ticket in this language that's the language of the rabbis and the prophets, right? He's sort of like deriding this project. What language should you speak in Israel or, the Jewish state? Speak German. That's the good Jewish language, right? Maybe French, but German, right? Most of the Jews are German, right? Certainly not Yiddish, right? They were all against Yiddish at that time. But Herzl thought that he was going to be able to basically import a European culture and society and politics into the Middle East and just everything would work out perfectly, almost like, copy and paste. Herzl never really thought about what would happen when what we would now call Mizrahi Jews from the Arab world got there, right? Most Jews from Iraq do not speak German or French, last I've checked, right? So Herzl was only focused on we need a place that Jews are in control of political power, right? And everything else, the sort of culture, the economics, the language, that's going to be imported from Germany. Right? So Herzl was naive about that second part, but he was right, for my opinion, about the politics part, right? There was sort of a ticking clock in Western Europe, and Herzl was one of the few people who were actually, raising the alarm bells when everybody else was sort of, moving on like normal. Ahad Ha'am was almost the flip. Ahad Ha'am writes, Herzl's so obsessed with, the attainment of political power, and he said, this is unrealistic. He said the biggest problem threatening Jews in Europe is not necessarily, safety. He's saying, Ahad Ha'am did believe, in some sense, in the project of political emancipation. What Ahad Ha'am was arguing was the bigger problem that Judaism's facing is just the lack of creativity. And in some sense, in some way, he was right. He ends up writing. This is a very powerful line in Achad Ha'am. I won't read it inside, but he says, so long as Judaism remains in the diaspora, it is at risk of splintering into as many denominations as there are nations in the world, right? It's a very astute observation, because you look in the, let's say the American Jewish community, and there's like 15 different types of Judaism, and that's just mainstream, And what Achad Ha'am was saying is, that's not good for Judaism, right? One can argue whether or not it's good or bad to have, a bunch of different denominations. Achad Ha'am certainly thought that was bad. And so Achad Ha'am said, we need a public sphere where these ideas can sort of seamlessly mesh. Of course, it's not that easy. Once you have debates about the public sphere, Israel's still embroiled with debates. Is that an Orthodox public sphere? Is that a non-Orthodox? So, but those debates aside, right, that would be 130 years later. So Achad Ha'am and Herzl, are both, they're both Zionists. They're both arguing that Jewish tenure in Europe, for one reason or other, and by extension America, or we'll say the diaspora, is not Judaism living out in its ideal form, right? Herzl, because Jews are a nation, nations need a nation needs a nation state. Achad Ha'am, Jews are a people have a culture. You can't, be creative with your culture if you're playing by, all these rules of other, socials and society, right? It's a lot harder for me to be fully creative if I'm a guest in your house than if I just get my own house, right? If I'm a guest in your studio, it's going to be a lot harder for me to paint whatever I want than if I have my own studio, right? So that was essentially Achad Ha'am's argument. What's interesting is that, Zionism, in some sense, ended up being a fusion of these two, right? It's very hard to think of modern day Israel without both, obviously, the political power, right? The government, the question of borders, security, the army, right? This is, all very important and very central to, Israel and Zionism. On the other hand, it would be strange to think about Israel without the rebirth of the language of Hebrew, the sort of idea that Judaism is a mixture of Jewish ethnic cultures from around the world. The idea that Achad Ha'am, I always say this, I've never heard this quoted anywhere else, but I always say that Achad Ha'am invented birthright, even though birthright is a trip, I think, maybe like 89 or 91 or, maybe a couple years later. But Achad Ha'am, just to, and this will maybe be a good way to end it, Achad Ha'am, quite literally, gave the tagline of birthright, right? He says, we need a center where Judaism is much more creative than it is in the diaspora. And then all the communities of the diaspora, it will breathe new life into them and people will be inspired by it, right? What is birthright but taking a bunch of, at least if you're in America, American Jews, who their view of Judaism is some old synagogue that they've maybe stepped into 3 times in the last 6 years, and they view Judaism as a religion, because that's how, most denominations view Judaism in America. And it's a religion that doesn't really speak to them theologically, and probably they don't practice much of the rituals, and, they don't speak the language, right? They don't speak Hebrew. And so when they get to synagogue, they're, sitting there kind of twiddling their thumbs. And all of a sudden you take them to Israel, and there's an alive culture and everyone's speaking Hebrew. And, in Israel, it doesn't matter if people are religious or not religious. Everybody has a sukkah, right? You go to Israel during Sukkot, right? There's Sukkot everywhere, right? You go to Israel during, any holiday, and you can sort of like feel it in the air. And there's sort of a vibrant feeling of aliveness to Judaism. And then people get back and they're like, birthright was amazing. I want to get more involved in the Jewish community, right? This was Achad Ha'am sort of, plan for the Jewish world. So we get this debate. But just the last thing I'll say is both Achad Ha'am and Herzl, and then later on, I don't know if we'll have time to go down this rabbit hole, but then, of course, both Achad Ha'am and Herzl were doing this under the guise of secularism. Later on, there's going to be, in the sort of second generation of Zionists, we'll see the rise of what's known as religious Zionists, so Abraham Kook, who ended up being the first chief rabbi of Israel, and I believe he moved to Jaffa sometime in the 19-teens or 1920s, and so he was this, great Hasidic rabbi of Europe that, essentially leaving, the yeshiva in Eastern Europe and going to Israel or, Palestine was essentially like, imagine leaving your post as the, head of Harvard or head of Yale and going to teach on, at some community college somewhere in South America, right? It was like that big of a jump in terms of prestige, but he does it for much more religious purposes. And, but what they would all argue, despite their nitpicking of politics or culture or religion in that role, is that emancipation is not going to work, right? For one reason or the other, right? That this is sort of a failed project, right? Jews should give up on this great project of, European emancipation / liberalism. And two, that Jews are a people, right? It's too reductive and too overly simplistic to say Judaism is a religion. And if your approach to Jewish safety or Judaism's prosperity, depending on if you're a Herzlian or a Chada'amian, if your approach to solving the problems of Jews or the problems of Judaism is rooted in a Jews are a religion premise, you're wrong, right? You're just not going to be able to fix it because your first premise is wrong. It's like you're building a whole house on styrofoam. It's just going to collapse. And so that was Zionism. We'll see next week. We'll stay in the Zionist, anti-Zionist category next week. Happy to hang out. I have 4 minutes if anybody has any thoughts or questions. Okay, and if not, I will see you all next week. We'll keep talking about Zionism a little bit, and then we'll talk about some later movements in the 1900s. And amazing. We'll have a wonderful week, everyone, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.